The streets of which we had just spoken, after turning a little to the left, became rather steep, as also wider, and in its vicinity was a hollow which was often filled with water and mud after rain, and a large stone was placed in its center to enable persons to pass over more easily. When Jesus reached this spot, his strength was perfectly exhausted. He was quite unable to move, and as the archers dragged and pushed him without showing the slightest compassion, he fell down against this stone, and the cross fell by his side. The cruel executioners were obliged to stop. They abused and struck him unmercifully, but the whole procession came to a standstill, which caused a degree of confusion. "Lift him up," said the Pharisees, "otherwise he will die in our hands." There were many women and children following the procession. The former wept, and the latter were frightened. Jesus, however, received support from above and raised his head, but these cruel men, far from endeavoring to alleviate his sufferings, put the crown of thorns again on his head before they pulled him out of the mud, and no sooner was he once more on his feet than they replaced the cross on his back. The crown of thorns which encircled his head increased his pain inexpressibly, and obliged him to bend on one side to give room for the cross, which lay heavily on his shoulders. The afflicted mother of Jesus had left the forum immediately after the unjust sentence was pronounced. She had employed herself in walking to many of the spots sanctified by our Lord and watering them with her tears. But when the sound of the trumpet, the rush of people, and the clang of the horsemen announced that the procession was about to start for Calvary, she could not resist her longing desire to behold her beloved Son once more, and she begged John to take her someplace through which he must pass. John conducted her to a palace, which had an entrance in that street which Jesus traversed after his first fall. It was, I believe, the residence of the high priest Caiaphas, whose tribunal was in the division called Sion. John asked and obtained leave from a kind-hearted servant to stand at the entrance mentioned above, with Mary and her companions. The Mother of God was pale, her eyes were red with weeping, and she was closely wrapped in a cloak of bluish-gray color. When those who were carrying the instruments for the execution approached, and the Mother of God saw their insolent and triumphant looks, she could not control her feelings, but joined her hands as if to implore the help of heaven, upon which one among them said to his companions, "What woman is that who is uttering such lamentations?" Another answered, "She is the mother of the Galilean." When the cruel men heard this, far from being moved to compassion, they began to make game of the grief of this most afflicted mother. They pointed at her, and one of them took the nails which were to be used for fastening Jesus to the cross, and presented them to her in an insulting manner. But she turned away, fixed her eyes upon Jesus, who was drawing near, and leaned against the pillar for support, lest she should again faint from grief, for her cheeks were as pale as death, and her lips almost blue. The Pharisees on horseback passed by first, followed by the boy who carried the inscription. Then came her beloved Son. He was almost sinking under the heavy weight of his cross, and his head, still crowned with thorns, was drooping in agony on his shoulder. He cast a look of compassion and sorrow upon his mother, staggered, and fell for the second time upon his hands and knees. Mary was perfectly agonized at this sight. She forgot all else. She saw neither soldiers nor executioners. She saw nothing but her dearly beloved Son, and springing from the doorway into the midst of the group who were insulting and abusing him, she threw herself on her knees by his side and embraced him. The only words I heard were, "Beloved Son," and "Mother," but I do not know whether those words were really uttered or whether they were only in my mind. A momentary confusion ensued. John and the holy women endeavored to raise Mary from the ground, and the archers reproached her, one of them saying, "What are you doing here, woman? He would not have been in our hands if he had been better brought up." In the meantime, the archers had raised Jesus and obliged him to carry the cross in a different manner. its arms being unfastened from the center and entangled in the ropes with which he was bound. He supported them on his arm, and by this means the weight of the body of the cross was a little taken off, as it dragged more on the ground. I saw numbers of persons standing about in groups, the greatest part amusing themselves by insulting our Lord in different ways, but a few veiled females were weeping. The procession had reached an arch formed in an old wall belonging to the town, when Jesus stumbled against a large stone which was placed in the middle of the archway. The cross slipped from his shoulders, he fell upon the stone, and was totally unable to rise. Many respectable-looking persons who were on their way to the temple stopped and exclaimed compassionately, "Look at the poor man, he is certainly dying," but his enemies showed no compassion. This fall caused a fresh delay, as our Lord could not stand up again, and the Pharisees said to the soldiers, "We shall never get him to the place of execution alive if you do not find someone to carry his cross." At this moment Simon of Cyrene, a pagan, happened to pass by, accompanied by his 3 children. He was a gardener, just returning home after working in a garden near the eastern wall of the city, and carrying a bundle of lopped branches. The soldiers, perceiving by his dress that he was a pagan, seized him and ordered him to assist Jesus in carrying his cross. He refused at first, but was soon compelled to obey, although his children, being frightened, cried and made a great noise, upon which some women quieted and took charge of them. Simon was much annoyed and expressed the greatest vexation at being obliged to walk with a man in so deplorable a condition of dirt and misery. But Jesus wept and cast such a mild and heavenly look upon him that he was touched, and instead of continuing to show reluctance, helped him to rise, while the executioners fastened one arm of the cross on his shoulders, and he walked behind our Lord, thus relieving him in a great measure from its weight. And when all was arranged, the procession moved forward. Simon was a stout-looking man, apparently about 40 years of age. His children were dressed in tunics made of varying material. The 2 eldest, named Rufus and Alexander, afterwards joined the disciples. The 3rd, much younger, but a few years later, went to live with Saint Stephen. Simon had not carried the cross after Jesus any length of time, before his heart felt deeply touched by grace.